I'm destabilizing. That's a bad sign.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our February Seesaw seminar. And so my name is Lee Neal, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the seminar series, and I'm a faculty member in population medicine. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming Beth Ventura, who's our speaker for today. And so Beth completed her master's at University of Michigan, and then she completed her PhD at the UBC Animal Welfare Program. And she's now an assistant teaching professor at the University of Minnesota. And her area of research is, well, she does a lot of different research topics, ranging from enrichment in pigs to laying hens to dairy cattle. But much of her recent research is focused on better understanding the human element in animal welfare and looking at stakeholder perceptions in terms of animal welfare. And so today she's going to be talking to us about thinking and communicating about farm animal welfare. Thanks so much for joining us, Beth.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks, hello to all of you joining remotely. That's the one good thing about the pandemic, is that we get a chance to connect a little bit more easily in some respects. So I'm pleased to be here. As Dr. Neal said, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about what I've gleaned from some of my research over the past few years, and I'll share a little bit about some recent studies that we've completed focused on veterinary students. But before I get into any of that, I need to figure out how to use my keyboard. And then once I do that, there we go, I can actually get into the talk. So before I begin, I'm actually going to share something of a reflexivity statement, since this talk is going to highlight a little bit of work from qualitative social science research. And so if you're unfamiliar with a reflexivity statement, that's generally just an accounting of and an acknowledgement of a researcher's own biases. Because, and I think that's important because it influences how we frame our research questions, sometimes how we interpret our data. And so in the interest of full transparency, here's mine. I started out as more of an applied ethologist, as Dr. Neal mentioned, conducting more applied animal behavior research at Michigan State and University of Maryland. And I was largely driven by the question of how we can best use science to understand what animals need. And I still do some of that, but I also have transitioned a little bit more to, since my PhD at UBC, to better figuring out how to translate what we find out about animals from applied ethology research into practice. And so given that so many of the barriers to translation are kind of sitting more at the human level, I started to focus there. And as I got more into that work, one of the resounding themes for me started to signal that before we can ultimately ever try to change someone's behavior to, do the good things for welfare, we have to maybe think about changing their minds. And before we can ever really change those minds, we really need to first walk way back and shut up and listen so that we can better understand those minds. And so a little bit, that's what I'm going to walk through today. First, I'll unpack a little bit why I think understanding stakeholder views are so important. I'll define and clarify some of the stakeholders that I'll focus on today, and then turn briefly to how we approach the study of such complex views about a really complicated topic like animal welfare. And then I will visit briefly some broad trends that we know so far about what the research suggests regarding where some of these stakeholders sit, how and where we might search for an overlap of views, which I think is a good way to start moving away from some of that polarization in views that we so often, I think, lament. And then for the second half, I'll turn to one group of stakeholders in particular, which are veterinarians and veterinary students. This is a group my research has recently started to focus in on and to hone in on. In part, that's a reflection of my role as an assistant teaching professor. I'm really involved now in education and training with respect to welfare. So I'll share a little bit about two studies that we've recently published that I think are important and certainly have changed a little bit of my thinking regarding how we start understanding better where people's attitudes and knowledge about animal welfare develop, and how we can leverage and refine training to improve welfare attitudes and knowledge, but also maybe help people hone some of those other important skills that improve their ability ultimately to act for and communicate about welfare more productively. And then finally, I'll just end with a couple of recommendations some recommendations. So let's start with background. I mentioned the word stakeholders a lot. What I mean when I say stakeholders is really anybody who has a stake in or an interest in the welfare of animals. So essentially, that's like everybody, but I tend to categorize them in some respects as first, we think very immediately of the people working within the industries. So farmers and veterinarians, scientists, researchers, et cetera. Anyone who really works with animals, obviously these are all critical stakeholders because we hold deep expertise and experience in animals and hopefully animal welfare. We're often positioned as experts or as insiders. But we also think of the public or members of the general public as stakeholders because they have lots of unique roles. Either they're functioning as consumers or as customers or as clients, but also even if they're none of those things, they're also citizens who contribute to a social consensus about how we should be using animals. And I will kind of acknowledge this is kind of an arbitrary category or categorization. This is obviously fluid. People hold multiple roles. Those on the inside are, of course, we're all also members of the public. But I think for the purpose of researching and understanding views toward animal welfare, especially toward the end of seeking maybe some common ground and understanding of how certain views can become polarized, I do think there's still value in understanding how someone's kind of membership in one or more of these stakeholder categories influences potentially some aspects of their identity and therefore their approach when it comes to animal welfare. So when it comes to understanding where people come at, when it comes to thinking about animal welfare, there are a lot of different psychological constructs that shape how people make decisions about these things. And so I think it's important for a moment to unpack some of those things and look at kind of how and why they might influence behavior, which is ultimately what we're here about. And so if you look to the communication literature, the psychology literature, you'd find a number of theories that sort of map out how what people think affects what they do, at least theoretically. And so what I'm going to do is just distill of those theories to break down some of these constructs. I think it's important to spend a moment to define what some of these are. So the first being value. So our values about something. Values are essentially relatively immutable. They are things that we seek to preserve through all aspects of life, through multi-contexts, through multiple situations. So they're trans-situational. They serve often as like either guiding life principles. So you may hold a value for liberty or fidelity or honesty or something like that. And it's not going to matter what situation you find yourself in, it's still going to be something that's really important to you. And when it comes to animal welfare, I'm going to talk in a little bit about some different ways in which people value animal welfare, but I like to study pain a little bit as well, or at least I'm interested in it. We could take, for example, the sentence, animals should be protected from feeling pain. That might be an expression of someone's values that they hold about how important pain is. And like, they're very concerned about, animals experiencing pain. In turn, values may then influence the formation of one's beliefs about something. So there's a lot of different types of beliefs. They can be both founded in the information that someone holds or the knowledge someone holds about a particular thing, as well as beliefs can also be founded in someone's values. So collectively, beliefs can be thought of as something that represent all of the information and feelings that someone has about anything that they can really keep in their minds, or an attitude object. And I'll explain a little bit more what an attitude object is in a moment. But let's take, for example, thinking about pain and thinking about a very common procedure in some of the livestock industries, in the dairy industries, for example, the practice of disbudding. So disbudding, for example, you may hold the belief, the informational belief that disbudding is painful. And maybe you've come to that belief because you've either read the literature on it or you practice disbudding yourself and you've observed firsthand that, yeah, ouch, that hurts. And so that might be your informational belief. And because you hold a deeper value about the importance of pain, you may also then believe that it's important to provide pain relief for a dairy calf or something like that. And then in turn, beliefs can influence one's attitudes about a particular attitude object. So an attitude object being anything that you can kind of hold in your mind and think about. It could be concrete or something more abstract. So attitudes in general are either positive or negative feelings towards something, or something that's valenced. So if we keep with the example of disbudding, if you have the attitude, a negative attitude toward disbudding without pain relief, that might be expressed in the agreement with the statement, disbudding without pain relief is bad. Disbudding with pain relief, good. And then finally, attitudes may contribute in part to somebody's intention to perform a given behavior. And according to some theories, intentions are one of the most powerful influencers of whether someone's actually going to do something or not. So, for example, if someone has an attitude that disbudding without pain relief is bad, it may influence then the formation of an intention to, like let's say if you're a veterinarian, that I will then plan to recommend comprehensive pain relief for disbudding. So that's a lot, but I will also just one more kind of caveat. Obviously, these are not the only things that influence whether someone does something or is prone to not doing something. There are lots of other things outside of one's own head, including things like social norms, like whether someone perceives there to be a lot of public pressure for something, what the temperature read is in the social circle or in someone's professional circle. There's also this element of external factors and how people think that they can navigate through those. So maybe something that they're prohibited from an economic standpoint, or they simply lack the knowledge or the training or something like that. So this is obviously, there's lots more to this, but I am particularly interested in kind of the psychological baggage that someone's carrying into decision making. And so I think it's really important to understand some of this psychological baggage, not only because it helps us understand how stakeholders ultimately navigate decisions around animal welfare, but also because understanding some of these things is, I think, really critical for effective communication and engagement and ultimately breaking down some of that polarization. Especially when we come to talking about something as complicated as animal welfare. So because communication and decision-making around animal care, animal welfare becomes complicated very quickly, I think it's really good to visit for a moment with some of the frameworks that exist to help us wrap our minds around how people value something as complex as welfare. Because obviously, I mean, a lot of us probably in here are either animal welfare scientists ourselves or somewhat of a practitioner in it. And from firsthand experience that, I mean, like everyone here has probably argued with someone about whether animal welfare is good or bad. And that's partially because people value welfare in different ways. And so the great news about that is that we don't have to wade around in the dark figuring out what people feel about welfare. There are really lovely frameworks that exist to help us start understanding where people sit and how people tend to value and prioritize welfare. And for me, especially, it's been very useful in my research to organize and understand and approach ultimately some of these challenging conversations. And so I think probably a lot of folks are already familiar with this framework, but if you're not, I'll just take a moment to briefly map it out. This is the 3 spheres or 3 circles framework developed by David Fraser and colleagues, which suggests that animal welfare can be valued by people in one or more of 3 different overlapping potentially ways. The first being biological functioning. So for example, if someone really strongly values biological functioning as important to welfare, they might be really focused on everything related to the physical health, disease, nutrition status of an animal. Someone else may much more strongly value aspects related to natural living. So anything to do with literally like the natural environment that an animal's maybe in, or the extent to which they can express behaviors and socialization that's inherent and intrinsic and motivated to their repertoires. And then finally, someone else may think, okay, those are good, those are important, but what I'm really focused on, what I strongly value is the affective state or the internal life of the animal. Everything to do with how an animal feels, whether it's, negative states like pain, stress, and fear, or also positive states like pleasure or contentment or satisfaction. So, what does the research say, and what do we know so far about what some of these different stakeholders value with respect to animal welfare? So I'll just map out a few big trends here, but there's a big disclaimer here that obviously the trends suggested from the literature, there's there's a great deal of diversity within members of each of these groups, and so it's not all farmers, not all vets, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to biological functioning, probably no surprise, super strong valuation in farmers as well as in veterinarians and scientists. But something that might be a little bit more surprising is that actually when we look to the public studies and the public research, we see a lot of evidence that the public also really values attributes in this area as well. So provision of good nutrition and water and healthcare, those sorts of things. This is all very important to members of the public and the research as well. So I think that's great. It should really be, I think, a good foundation for establishing and identifying some shared values, and something that should be highlighted in order to help us start breaking down some of that polarization. Like, hey, we all care about this. This is good. In terms of affective state, it's a little bit more complicated, in part because there's obviously lots of different elements related to affective state. I'll focus on pain, because we've got a lot of research on people's attitudes and how they care about pain in this area. And the take-home message here is it's complicated, as with most things with animal welfare. But for example, if we look to farmers, some of the research suggests that their views and how they value pain in animals kind of depends in part on the type of pain. So for example, shorter-term routine procedures maybe not prioritized as critically, but when you look to how folks look at chronically painful conditions, there is some really nice evidence that members of farming communities very much do care about these things. So that's really good. When we look to the veterinary attitude literature, attitudes toward pain are again kind of all over the place depending on what particular study you're looking at, but the trends generally do seem to be kind of improving. There's more concern, more proactivity and tendency to want to treat pain and prescribe pain relief, et cetera. And then when we look to the public, it's pretty straightforward. Pain relief and avoiding and preventing pain in farm animals is pretty much non-negotiable. Inflicting pain is just not something that's really supportable, according to most of the public attitude literature. And then finally, natural living. This is probably the sphere that's going to contribute to the most, to our understanding of the most polarization when it comes to farmers and veterinarians versus someone like the public. There's evidence to suggest that a lot of farmers, a lot of veterinarians don't put as much weight toward the natural living sphere. Of course, not all of them, a lot of them still do. But it's much more robust in the public. This is something that's really crucially important. So, drink break for me. All right, so I'm gonna transition now and kind of switch topics a little bit to share two studies that I've recently published with some colleagues that I think have been very useful for me in thinking about this area a little bit more critically. Also, I think they help shed some light on how training and education can influence people's attitudes and their knowledge about animal welfare. and also share some insight on how we can maybe develop and leverage some training opportunities, not just to maybe improve welfare attitudes, but also to tackle some of those communication skills, those engagement skills, which ultimately I hope will serve to kind of depolarize and help people engage more productively on solutions and finding solutions. So overarching objectives for some of this work is basically we're interested in understanding how training contributes to the formation of views toward welfare, specifically in veterinarian populations in North America. Actually, both of those are, we did it in the US and the general in the Midwest, but I'll talk more about that in a second. And the point is, of course, to improve veterinarians' capacity to act as agents of change to promote good welfare for animals. So I'm seeing some comments in the chat. I will answer the questions in just a moment after the end, just to make sure I can get through what I was going to talk about. Okay, so just to provide you with a little bit more context as to why we've chosen to focus on this area. And that's that I think there's some worrying data, especially historically in the literature, suggesting that sensitivity to animal welfare might seem to diminish in students as they progress throughout their veterinary training. So for example, compared to first and second year students, there's some studies to suggest that later career students in a number of different countries and different veterinary programs in the US as well as in Europe perceive a range of super painful conditions as less painful compared to the first years. They also start to attribute lower levels of intelligence to animals, including dogs and cats, but also some livestock animals. And they also seem less likely to treat painful conditions. So that's not great. What is that telling us? What's going on? There's a couple of different hypotheses that have been thrown out by some of the authors of these studies. Potentially, it might be due to some kind of learning of attitudinal norms within as students proceed through their training. Maybe students are starting to acquire increased Cartesian views toward animals, where they're starting to believe less in the capacity and the sentience of different animals. One suggestion that I find pretty compelling is that maybe instead it's not so much that, but it's more that students are developing a coping mechanism in the face of constant confronting of emotional distress. So similarly to what occurs in human medicine, students are developing maybe a self-protection mechanism by becoming less empathetic with their patients. The good news is that not all research documents this. There's more recent work tracking the same students as they go through their training that don't find this kind of decline. So maybe it's because veterinary curricula are embedding more of this welfare training, more of this attention toward pain, and embedding more of this applied ethology research. But nonetheless, this is definitely an area that I think, and a lot of others do, that it bears more research to better understand how attitudes to welfare shift throughout veterinary school, and how we can ultimately improve welfare training. So this takes me to the goal of the first project that I'd like to share about today, which was conducted with some of my wonderful colleagues at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Pearl Janitsky, as well as at the time she was a student, but now she is a practicing veterinarian, Dr. Claire Tureau, where we tried to investigate what happens when students learn about animals on the farm, essentially. So we had a number of objectives for this study. I'm just going to focus briefly on two of them. First, we were interested in just understanding, well, where are they at? Where are students at in their first year before they even get into this kind of coursework? We want to know about, their knowledge, their attitudes, their values. And we were focusing on swine because why not? But no, my colleague is a swine vet, but also this particular aspect of the course that we were kind of in charge with, and that she's in charge with, or excuse me, in charge over, focuses on swine. So we wanted to understand kind of student perceptions at baseline. And then we wanted to know how those might change as they go through more traditional types of learning, like in the classroom as well as online, but also once they go on to an actual swine farm, how does that shift their knowledge and shift their attitudes potentially in that area? So what we did was we took all of the first year students that were enrolled in this early professional development course at the University of Minnesota. We did this last spring. No, not last spring. Last spring is a black hole. 2019. We took them and they sat through two types of learning experiences. The first being just the traditional kind of classroom lecture, introducing them to what's going on, what's the swine industry, what are some challenges and opportunities relevant to veterinary medicine in this field. And then students also watched a series of online lectures, which is a screenshot of those, to introduce some basic concepts about swine behavior, swine welfare, and commercial systems, and cover some kind of challenges and opportunities with respect to different types of housing systems. And then students go and tour our university research farm. They're led through the facility where they visit the farrowing the farrowing rooms, the individual gestation stalls, which this unit has, as well as the group pen gestation rooms. And they're toured through this by the swine veterinary faculty. So students do this anyway, but the portion of our study that we were doing is we also asked students to complete three surveys at three different time points. At baseline, before they do any learning, halfway, kind of before they go on the farm, but after they've done the more traditional learning, and then after the farm, again, they do a post-visit survey. So I'll show you a little bit about just some of the details of the surveys. So their baseline survey was composed of 36 questions that are mixed method, meaning there was a series of quantitative questions that were close-ended, as well as a few qualitative or open-ended questions. So the students were asked a number of questions about different demographic attributes. They were given questions to tap into what they knew about swine behavior, and a little bit about the swine industry. We gave them 9 questions to get at their pig attitudes or their pigitudes. And then we also wanted to know what their generalized attitudes were toward the level of welfare on swine farms, like most swine farms, what they thought. So just a little bit more detail about, for example, the knowledge questions. We asked them 10 multiple choice questions ranging, tapping into some aspects related to basic husbandry and management, to swine behavior, as well as to a few more applied problems. And then in terms of like pigitude, we asked them a series of Likert scale questions where students had to indicate their agreement to statements like pigs are intelligent, cute, friendly, or conversely negative things like, are they dirty, intimidating, dangerous? Students then did the same survey after they'd gone through the classroom and online lectures, and then again after the farm. The only addition is after the farm, we also then asked them specific targeted questions about what they thought about the farm that they had visited. And specifically, we expanded and asked them some qualitative questions about, well, what did you like best about management and welfare? What was your biggest concern about management and welfare? So just I know this is I'm breaking the slide rules, too much information on slide, but just bear with me. So we had both quantitative and qualitative data. So we've got both quantitative and qualitative analysis. From the quantitative side of things, we looked for association between demographics and a host of outcome variables, including the additive pig knowledge score. So students could get from 1 to 10 on that quiz. We also compiled a composite pig attitude score. So a lower score basically in response to those Likert scale items indicates a lower attitude toward pigs or a kind of more negative attitude toward pigs. And then as we increase compositely, we can get like a higher, more positive attitude toward pigs. We also looked at associations with welfare satisfaction on farms and their students' use of the 3 animal welfare spheres of biological functioning, affective state, and natural living. And I'll explain for a moment where we got those. And then finally, we also looked to see how students shifted throughout this kind of these 3 surveys. So whether they improved their knowledge or improved their perception of welfare or improved their attitudes toward pigs, for example. And so depending on whether the variables were categorical or continuous, we used different statistical tests, which you can see here, and I can tell you more about that. But in the interest of time, I'm going to continue on to just briefly sharing, especially if folks are unfamiliar with what is going on with qualitative research. Essentially, what happens with qualitative research is we apply a type of analysis. In this case, we applied content analysis to students' open-ended responses on that post-visit survey, where they were like, so tell me about this farm. What do you think about it? And we got 2 sets of themes from this. The first set was what students liked or disliked about the visited farm. And then we also looked at the use of welfare spheres, so biological functioning, affective state, or natural living. So for example, these are 2 kind of screenshots of responses from some students. So you can see in the yellow, for example, students, might have said something like, they liked that the feeding systems and the pen settings were very unique. They allowed for monitoring of how much the pigs are eating, highlighting particular concerns for health issues and proper veterinary care. All of these comments are tapping into this aspect of biological functioning. Whereas conversely, students might have raised natural living areas, like being discontented with the fact that the pigs have very limited movement. Since wild sows spend a lot of their time moving, it's concerning for them to have such limited space. Or alternatively, pigs are very smart animals. They have no source of enrichment, which makes me concerned about their mental welfare. That's tapping very nicely into that affective state situation. So a little bit about what we found, just briefly, who are those students? We saw it's a veterinary population, so most of them identify as female. Most of them were fairly young, either between 19 and 23 or 24 and 34 days of age. And then the majority are identifying as being from urban or suburban environments. Excuse me just a second. Most of them also had reporting limited to no pig experience. They'd never been to a pig farm. Kind of disappointingly for someone like me, who's a welfare professor, the majority of them had never had an animal behavior or a welfare course, although that's pretty common, I think. And most didn't want to practice livestock. So what do they know? Well, before they went in to their learning, their baseline knowledge about pigs was fairly poor. Not really that surprising, but on average, a failure on the quiz. The students did best on some of the more basic questions focused on body condition, gestation length, but they really seemed to struggle a lot with those applied industry and behavior questions. Their baseline attitudes toward pigs was not too bad, though. All of them indicated that they believed that animal welfare, or AW, is at least moderately important. Most of them had positive beliefs in the sentience of pigs, although they did have a weaker kind of liking toward pigs, as not a lot of them felt that they were cute or friendly, for example. But if students were coming from rural backgrounds or they were reporting previous pig experience, they tended to have more positive pigitudes. I'm going to skip what happened after the classroom and the online lectures and focus directly on the farm visits. I think this is the most interesting piece. The first thing is that knowledge about pigs improved, but not great. Just over average of 6 out of 10 correct. Whoa, that's a depressing stat if you're an educator. What seemed to happen was that the visit seemed to kind of undo students' intuitions about pig behavior. So they were starting to get more questions wrong than they had earlier gotten about social structure and weaning age and stuff like that. So that's a bummer. On the other hand, their pigitudes improved on average. And that was largely driven by once students kind of got to meet pigs, they started to see them as more friendly and less intimidating. So that's a win. However, what was really interesting was how the visit shaped their perception of welfare and how students reacted to welfare on the farm. There's a lot of results here that I can't go through, but what I will leave this study with is that we started to see a polarization effect of the farm on reactions in the students. So a lot of students going in because they just hadn't had a lot of experience with livestock or industry, they seemed to be fairly neutral and not sure whether they felt that welfare on farms was good or bad. But after the farm visit, we started to see a polarization where more students moved either to the satisfied box or to the dissatisfied box. Our urban students, our non-pig experience students, and our non-livestock students became more dissatisfied with welfare, and also were fairly grumpy with conditions on the farm, especially if they were focused on natural living. Conversely, we had our rural, our pig experience, and our livestock interested students. They were more satisfied in the status of, or in the situation of welfare on other farms, and tended to be more positive about the farm that they had visited if they were focusing on aspects related to biological functioning. So this was, I think, a big lesson for us, because there were lots of good things about the teaching here, or excuse me, there was always good things about the teaching because I was working with fabulous colleagues. But there's some interesting lessons, because what we're doing in this teaching is polarizing our students a little bit. Yikes, that's not what we want to do. So this brings me to the next study that I'd like to highlight, which presents kind of an attempt to use a specific assignment to break some of that segmentation and to depolarize. And that study was conducted with Dr. Katie Proudfoot, who's now at the University of Prince Edward Island, but this was focused on students at Ohio State, which is where she used to be. So our goal here was to assess the influence of a frame of function assignment on students' tolerance toward and readiness to engage with those who express differing welfare values, and then to look to see how student demographics might associate with some of those responses. So I'm going to kind of zoom through the methods because I know we've got about 5 minutes left. I'll try to get through this, but essentially students in this course, or excuse me, in this study, we're actually taking a welfare specific course. And we asked them Katie asked them after they had kind of learned a little bit about some welfare frameworks to share, well, what are your most important welfare value of those 3 spheres? Then we asked students to identify someone in their lives that they knew had a different opinion on a specific welfare topic. We invited them to interview that person with the goal of keeping their lips buttoned and just listening so that they could understand their interviewee's views. And then they needed to write back their interviewee's perspective as if it was their own. And that's kind of an exercise in frame reflection, or essentially putting yourself in the shoes of someone else so that you can kind of get outside of your own way of thinking about something. And then afterwards, after doing that, we asked students to reflect on their perceptions toward their interviewee and some of the implications that might have for their future careers. For analysis, we did a retroactive content analysis of the student responses, and then used Kruskal-Wallis and chi-square and multivariable logistic regression models to assess for some of those associations with demographics. So with our results, again, most of the students identified as female. Most of them did not want to work with livestock. Interestingly, most of them, or excuse me, more of them expressed that affective state was most important to them, followed by biological functioning, and then a minority of them saying that natural living is most important. And again, not very surprising, the students who wished to work with our livestock or our food animals were more focused on prioritizing biological functioning. Again, that maps with kind of our understanding of previous work. So what about how the assignment affected their opinions? We broke out their responses into kind of 3 clusters of themes. The first was themes that we considered to be productive for their skills in engaging with others. So if students, for example, able to identify shared values, even though they were different from their interviewee, or if they were actually reflecting on how important it is to actually listen to someone else, and to acknowledge that there is some value in the other person's perspective, even if they themselves disagree with it. So, for example, one student shared, I should approach differences with an open mind, and I should actually be willing to listen to why people think the way they do. So that's a win. We were very excited to see those. On the other hand, some students were still kind of raising some maybe not very productive themes. And we can talk about in the question and answer session on why we found those to be unproductive, but for the interest of time, a lot of specification, or excuse me, a lot of discussion on, oh God, my interview's an idiot. I wish that they weren't so much of an idiot. They're based off of emotions, not facts. I feel like I have a lot more experience. Sometimes our students were veering into like judging their interviewees from a very negative standpoint, desperate need to reason out her answers and fumbling through her responses. And sometimes the students forgot what they were supposed to do. So she seemed ignorant and unwilling to hear my opinions. Well, the point wasn't to share your opinions. So we all struggle with that though. Interestingly, the students who were female were more often raising unproductive themes compared to the male students in that assignment. But not to end it on a negative note, overall, students still felt that the assignment was helpful to building their skills as veterinarians, and specifically improving their readiness to engage with complex conversations and to build a better relationship with their future clients. So I love this quote from the student. For me, this exercise translates into practice as a veterinarian and how imperative it is to take the time to fully discuss controversial topics with clients. When you can recognize the motivation behind people's beliefs and decisions, it fosters a better relationship for communication, and ultimately this promotes the welfare of the animals being treated. And what was also nice was that a number of students raised that this exercise was also helpful for their personal lives. So this quote, for example, whether I'm trying to sincerely understand why a client would want to dock their dog's ears or why my father voted for Donald Trump, I can use these skills to allow me to see a different perspective than my own. So this leads to my recommendations. The core objective of that assignment for us was to build our students' capacity to more effectively engage and relate to others on topics related to welfare, even if they disagree, even if they're right on the issue. Because we found that students need to recognize the value in reflective listening and non-judgment, because those can really help create space, I think, to achieve relationships built on trust and collaboration. And I think that points to lessons for all of us, not just veterinarians, but farmers and scientists and other professionals in the animal fields. So that's what I'd like to kind of end with, some recommendations for how to approach some of these conversations. The first, I think, is that it would behoove all of us to pursue communication training to familiarize ourselves with the literature on welfare attitudes and public acceptance of science and theories of behavior change. And I also would consider a good strategy for those in charge of curriculum planning, likewise, implement coursework on these types of subjects as a core part of training future practitioners that I think will be then better placed to meet the demands of our fields. And then secondly, I'm very into this concept of adaptive transparency, which is essentially, yes, educate, information share, but then be prepared to listen and respond and engage in an honest conversation with someone with the intent that maybe you can learn how to do better. So ask questions like, what does good welfare look like to you? And listen. Can you share the reasons behind your belief? And I think when we do that, we can kind of create better, more non-judgmental spaces for open dialogue, which I think is ultimately key in building better relationships between animal practitioners and the public. And as a bonus, I think it'll also help people make them a little bit more likely to listen and to apply ultimately our recommendations for animal welfare. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I welcome your conversation and your thoughts. Thank you.